The transition didn't happen gradually. In the 1840s, census records across Europe and North America were inconsistent, localized, and often incomplete. By the 1860s, they had become uniform, detailed, and strangely precise. The change occurred in a single generation. Faster than literacy rates improved, faster than infrastructure expanded, faster than bureaucratic institutions typically evolve. Consider the scale of what this required. To conduct a precise census in 1850, you needed trained enumerators in every county. You needed standardized forms printed and distributed across thousands of miles. You needed a classification system that worked equally well in rural farmland and industrial cities. You needed a centralized office capable of compiling millions of individual records into summary tables. All without computers, without telephones, without reliable postal systems in many regions. The official explanation is coordination. Governments invested in statistical bureaus. International conferences established best practices. Nations learned from each other's successes. The technology of paper forms and lithographic printing made mass standardization possible for the first time. But the speed of adoption feels compressed. Take the 1851 British Census. It didn't just count people. It categorized them by precise age, occupation, birthplace, marital status, and household relationship. It recorded whether individuals were blind, deaf, or mentally ill. It noted literacy status. It tracked migration patterns down to the parish level. This level of detail required an administrative apparatus that hadn't existed a decade earlier. The 1841 census had been far simpler. Names, ages rounded to the nearest 5 years, occupations listed inconsistently. 10 years later, the system had become almost surgical in its precision. The entire structure appeared fully formed, as if the methodology had been designed in advance and simply implemented when the moment arrived. The American census followed a similar pattern. In 1850, the U.S. Census introduced individual enumeration for the first time. Every person was listed by name. Age was recorded exactly. Place of birth was documented. The census even tracked property values, literacy rates, and school attendance. Compare that to 1840, when households were counted as units and individuals were recorded only as tally marks in age and gender categories. The leap was institutional. It required not just more enumerators but a different kind of thinking. A bureaucratic logic that treated populations as data sets rather than communities. And this logic appeared across multiple nations within the same narrow time frame. France's 1851 census introduced occupational categories that matched Britain's. Prussia's 1855 census used age brackets identical to those in the United States. Russia's 1857 census adopted household enumeration formats that mirrored Western European models, despite having limited diplomatic coordination with those governments. These weren't nations copying each other through slow correspondence. The systems appeared simultaneously as if drawn from a shared template. The architectural evidence compounds the pattern. Census offices built in the 1850s were designed to process volumes of data far beyond what the populations of the time required. Britain's General Register Office, completed in 1851, included filing systems capable of holding records for tens of millions of people, more than double the country's population at the time. The U.S. Census Office, established in 1850, included storage vaults designed for a century of expansion. These weren't buildings constructed for present need. They were infrastructure for populations that didn't exist yet. The same decade saw the standardization of vital statistics. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, all adopted uniform formats across Europe and North America between 1850 and 1865. The administrative machinery for tracking individuals appeared in parallel with the census systems, as if both were part of a larger bureaucratic framework being implemented simultaneously. The timing creates pressure. Why did so many governments decide to formalize population tracking in the same 15-year window? Why did they adopt such similar methods? Why did the systems appear so fully developed, rather than evolving gradually through trial and error? The official answer is industrialization. Governments needed accurate population data to plan infrastructure, allocate resources, and manage urbanization. The tools for mass data collection, printed forms, trained clerks, centralized offices, became available at the same time that the need became urgent. But the precision feels anticipatory. In 1850, the United States had 23 million people. The census infrastructure built that decade was designed to handle 100 million. Britain's systems were similarly overbuilt. France's Statistical Bureau occupied a building that wouldn't be filled to capacity until the 20th century. These weren't governments planning for gradual growth. They were building for populations that hadn't arrived yet, and building as if they knew exactly how large those populations would become. The data itself shows another pattern. Census records from the 1850s onward are remarkably complete. Missing entries are rare. Errors are minimal. The level of administrative discipline required to achieve this consistency is difficult to reconcile with the chaos of mid-19th century governance. Consider what it meant to conduct a census in 1850. No telephones. No computers. No typewriters in most offices. Communication between regional offices and central bureaus took weeks. Enumerators were often poorly paid and minimally trained. Yet the final data tables showed almost no gaps, almost no inconsistencies. The records feel machine-produced. But they were created by hand, by thousands of individuals working independently across vast distances, all somehow adhering to the same standards with the same level of precision. The question isn't whether the censuses happened. The records exist. The data is verified. The systems functioned. The question is why they appeared so suddenly, so uniformly, and at such scale. The pattern becomes more visible when you look at infrastructure. In 1817, New York State authorized construction of the Erie Canal. The project would connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean through 363 miles of hand-dug waterway. At the time, the region's population was sparse. Most of western New York was undeveloped. There were no cities along the proposed route that justified such massive investment. The canal opened in 1825. Within a decade, cities appeared along its length as if they'd been planned in advance. Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse. Urban centers that grew with geometric precision, laid out in grids that anticipated populations far larger than existed at the time. The infrastructure preceded the demand. Britain followed a similar pattern. Between 1830 and 1850, the United Kingdom built 6,000 miles of railway. The construction happened before most regions had populations large enough to justify the expense. Small towns received stations designed for cities. Rural areas got rail infrastructure built to handle industrial-scale freight that wouldn't exist for another generation. The official explanation is speculation. Investors bet on future growth. Governments planned for expansion. The infrastructure was meant to stimulate development, not respond to it. But the scale suggests something else. Consider the London sewer system. Construction began in 1859 under the direction of Joseph Bazalgette. The system was designed to serve a population of 4 million people. London's population at the time was 2.8 million. Bazalgette didn't build for current need. He built tunnels wide enough to accommodate twice the city's waste output. He engineered pumping stations with capacity far beyond what the 1860s required. When asked why, he allegedly said he was accounting for future growth. But his calculations were exact. The system he built in 1865 reached capacity in 1960, almost a century later, at precisely the population levels he'd designed for. How did he know? American cities showed the same foresight. Philadelphia's water system, completed in 1850, included reservoirs sized for a population of 800,000. The city had 340,000 residents at the time. Boston's water infrastructure, finished in 1848, was built to serve 500,000 people. The population was 136,000. New York's Croton Aqueduct, opened in 1842, delivered 90 million gallons of water per day to a city that needed less than half that amount. These weren't small overestimates. They were systems built for populations 2, 3, sometimes 4 times larger than existed, and the calculations proved accurate when those populations eventually materialized decades later. The administrative systems mirrored the physical infrastructure. In 1854, Britain established the General Board of Health with regional offices in cities that barely existed. The bureaucratic framework anticipated urban populations that wouldn't emerge until the 1880s. The United States formalized its postal system in the 1840s, creating zip code precursors and sorting infrastructures designed for mail volumes that wouldn't be reached until after the Civil War. France reorganized its departments in 1852, creating administrative boundaries that aligned with population distributions from the 1890s, not the 1850s. The pattern holds across systems. Governments weren't reacting to growth. They were building frameworks for growth that hadn't happened yet. The timing intersects with the census standardization. The same decade that saw precise population counting also saw infrastructure built for populations that didn't exist. The same governments that suddenly knew exactly how many people lived in each district were simultaneously constructing systems sized for future totals they couldn't have reliably predicted. Unless they weren't predicting. Unless they were working from different information. Look at the storage facilities. Between 1840 and 1860, grain silos, warehouses, and storage depots were built across the American Midwest at a scale that didn't match agricultural output. The facilities sat partially empty for years. Then, in the 1870s, they filled. Britain built coal storage infrastructure in the 1850s designed for industrial output from mines that hadn't been opened yet. The facilities were too large for current production, too expensive to justify as speculation. But when those mines opened in the 1860s and 70s, the infrastructure was already in place, perfectly sized. The railroads show the pattern most clearly. In the United States, railway companies surveyed routes through uninhabited territories in the 1840s. They laid track through regions with no settlements, no industry, no apparent reason for a railway to exist. The official story is land speculation and federal land grants. But the routes themselves tell a different story. The railways didn't meander. They didn't follow existing trails or waterways. They cut straight lines through wilderness, as if drawn on a map by someone who knew exactly where cities would eventually appear. And cities did appear, along those routes in the exact locations the railways had anticipated. Britain's railway network followed the same logic. Lines were built connecting small towns that had no economic relationship to each other in the 1840s. The routes made no sense commercially. 20 years later, those towns had become industrial centers, and the rail connections were essential. The infrastructure preceded the economy that justified it. The census systems fit within this framework. If governments were building physical infrastructure for populations that hadn't arrived yet, they would need administrative infrastructure to match. Census systems that could track millions of individuals, bureaucratic frameworks that could manage data at scale, filing systems that could store records for generations. The 1850s saw the simultaneous appearance of both. Physical and administrative infrastructure, built in parallel, both designed for future populations with surprising accuracy. The architectural similarities compound the pattern. Census offices in Britain, the United States, France, and Prussia used nearly identical filing systems. Cabinet designs matched. Form layouts were interchangeable. Even the architectural plans for the buildings themselves showed remarkable consistency. This wasn't coincidence. It was standardization on an international scale, implemented without formal treaties or coordination mechanisms that historians can point to. The buildings themselves raise questions. Many census offices constructed in the 1850s included design features that wouldn't become standard until the 20th century. Fireproof vaults, climate-controlled storage, ventilation systems designed to preserve paper records for over a century. These weren't governments planning for a few decades of use. They were building archives meant to last generations. The water systems show the same foresight. London's sewers included expansion joints and access tunnels that wouldn't be used until the 1920s. The original 1860s design accounted for technologies that didn't exist yet: electric pumps, chemical treatment facilities, automated flow controls. Bazalgette's plans included notations for future upgrades that wouldn't be implemented for 70 years. American aqueducts were built with similar anticipation. The Croton system included valve chambers sized for populations New York wouldn't reach until 1900. The infrastructure wasn't adaptable, it was pre-adapted, as if designed with knowledge of exactly how the city would grow. The question becomes unavoidable. How did mid-19th century engineers predict population growth with such precision? How did bureaucrats design administrative systems that would remain functional for a century? How did governments across multiple continents adopt identical standards within the same 15-year window? The official answer is parallel development. Nations faced similar challenges and arrived at similar solutions independently. Engineers shared knowledge through professional societies. Governments copied successful models from their neighbors. But the evidence suggests something more coordinated. The systems didn't just resemble each other. They interlocked. An American census form could be processed in a British office using the same filing system. A French railway gauge matched British and American standards despite no formal agreement. The infrastructure feels inherited. Not designed from scratch, but implemented from existing templates. Templates that accounted for populations, technologies, and urban layouts that wouldn't exist for decades. Whether this reflects inheritance from an earlier administrative framework or represents an unprecedented moment of international coordination, the evidence remains. The word Tartaria appears on European maps from the 16th through 19th centuries. It referred to the vast territories of Central Asia, regions controlled at various times by Mongol successor states, the Russian Empire, and independent khanates. The term was geographic, not political, a label for lands that European cartographers understood imperfectly. By the 1860s, the name had largely disappeared from official use. In recent years, the term has been reinterpreted. Some researchers use Tartaria as shorthand for a different reading of 19th century history, one that examines the administrative and infrastructural patterns we've discussed not as coincidence or parallel development, but as evidence of inherited systems. Three interpretations exist for what we've observed. The first is conventional history. The Industrial Revolution created similar pressures across multiple nations simultaneously. Governments responded with similar solutions. Engineers shared knowledge through international conferences. The infrastructure was speculative, built by investors betting on growth. The accuracy of their predictions was luck combined with general understanding of industrialization's trajectory. The second interpretation suggests coordination. Perhaps formal or informal networks existed between governments, engineering societies, and administrative bodies. Networks that operated beyond what traditional historical records capture. The standardization wasn't coincidental but deliberately orchestrated through channels that left minimal documentation. The third interpretation is the one associated with the Tartaria framework. It proposes that the infrastructure and administrative systems of the 1850s weren't built from scratch but represented the formalization and rebranding of existing networks. That the census systems appeared fully formed because they were adaptations of earlier frameworks. That the over-engineered infrastructure wasn't prediction but inheritance. Buildings and systems already present, being repurposed and claimed by emerging nation-states. All three interpretations attempt to explain the same evidence. The year without a summer. Volcanic winter from Mount Tambara's eruption. Crop failures across Europe and North America. Mass migration. Social upheaval. And in the decades immediately following, the sudden appearance of formalized population systems, infrastructure built for populations that didn't exist, administrative standardization across continents. The timing creates one final point of friction. The Tartaria framework isn't about proving a lost civilization. It's a lens for examining historical patterns that feel compressed, over-prepared, or systematically coordinated in ways that challenge standard narratives. Whether those patterns reflect inherited infrastructure, unprecedented international cooperation, or simply the normal chaos of industrialization interpreted through a modern perspective, the evidence invites examination. The census data stopped feeling human in the 1850s because it became something else. A system. A framework. A method of population management that appeared across the world within a single generation, built to scales that wouldn't be justified for decades. The buildings still stand. The records still exist. The infrastructure still functions. And the questions remain open.